On the Midweek Roundup, we take our news stories from our newsletter, and for those watching at home, we look at the news stories from the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup, which is, if you're not familiar, is our weekly newsletter. Comes out on Monday mornings, 9 a.m. Eastern Time, and we put those news stories in the format of social media and international ed news, and divide those international ed news stories into a couple of different areas related to big picture issues, solution central, and then a global roundup of different international ed stories from the other major destination markets and some others that are not so major, but provide some interesting context for us. So we take those news stories, and each week on Wednesdays, we go in depth into three of the themes that we see developing through those news stories. The first of which we'll talk about in a minute is a social media related story, and then a couple of other international ed related stories. So this week in between Christmas and New Year's, where most of the stories that made up this week's newsletter was a little bit slower news week than usual, as many of the publishers and typical outlets took breaks over the festive period. But we're back up to speed. I think in the coming week we'll have a much broader range of topics that we might be covering. Let's get first into our question number one of the week. Will TikTok survive in the United States in 2023? And this is a really important question because if for those that have been paying attention in the news, you've really seen a distinct lack of positive news stories related to TikTok when it comes to government regulations in the United States. We saw in the height of the pandemic and at the height of the U.S.-China kind of economic and political and social kind of trade wars that were going on, we saw a real turning, even a bipartisan turning against the platform because of its data security issues related to access to U.S. user data by people in China that would be connected to the Chinese Communist Party. And that has gathered momentum since then. It went quiet for a year, or for a few months, if not a year, around the elections. But now we're seeing, we've seen a kind of a resurgence of that. We've seen TikTok obviously continue to boom globally with over 1 billion users around the world that are on that platform. And that's a huge number because when you look at it, India, the most popular, what is actually probably the most popular country in the nation, cannot access TikTok because it's banned in that country. So to have over 1 billion users outside of India is pretty significant. And we look at TikTok as a global powerhouse, and even social media management companies like Hootsuite, they have that front and center. And every time you log in, that Hootsuite has over 1 billion, or TikTok has over 1 billion users now. When are you going to join in? Really encouraging brands to start using TikTok more if they're not already on the platform. We've seen within the higher ed community, we've seen some disconnects going on. There are some universities that have gone all in on TikTok and have been active for many months in developing content and establishing a presence and a brand recognition on the platform. Where I work currently, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, we have both an UNLV admissions TikTok account and a team of students that are managing that, as well as an official UNLV TikTok account. So when you look at what TikTok has done on the university level, it's starting to take hold, and many institutions, particularly those that were already savvy on social media trends and platforms and trying to keep up, have already invested time and energy and money into developing content for that platform and across their social media. But what you see in this new wave of anti-TikTok legislation that's being proposed, we've seen already states, including South Dakota and a few others, that have banned state officials from having TikTok on their devices, that in certain states like South Dakota, public universities cannot use TikTok for marketing and communications. We've seen just this past week the news story that'll be dropping into the chat in a minute or two has information from the most recent legislation proposed in the House before they went. They're in their current leadership throes of what's that's going to look like in the new year. But we've seen the House propose a ban on, or it's actually already happened. The House has banned any of its House of Representative employees, and it's obviously Congress people as well as staff, paid staff, from using TikTok on House-owned devices. So obviously a member of Congress could potentially use his own device, not a personal device, and then still access it. But you wonder if that would actually be frowned upon significantly in the Congress these days. We'd see about that. But you see a lot of negative press, particularly in government circles, from, I mentioned, the state organizations, but there's also in this article that is mentioning from CNN, mentioning this ban. There's actually it's kind of the forerunner to what is going to be because of the security risks for access to particularly government officials' data. Because of that, there's also as part of the legislation included in the $1.7 billion omnibus bill that Congress passed last week during the Christmas recess, or prior to the Christmas recess. You see that there a federal ban on TikTok on government devices is part of that legislation. So that should be coming soon as well. So those security concerns that U.S. data, member data, user data would be accessible to individuals in China is causing the U.S. government to basically shut up shop, and in terms of government access to social media, to this social media platform. So you wonder if it will ever really extend beyond that. And that's something that I think might be a bridge too far, frankly, for the U.S. government to take that significant of a step, given how significant U.S. users on the platform are. Don't have the exact numbers, but it's in the hundreds of millions, or probably close to 100 million at least in the United States that are already on TikTok. And we certainly see the youth of the country that once you're able to get a social media account, that's usually one of the first go-tos that the youth, particularly pre-college age students, are going to be picking up on. But you even see adults and celebrities jumping on the bandwagon too with their TikTok presence. And when you know Sir Anthony Hopkins has an official account, Sir Patrick Stewart as well, and all these famous actors, older actors having accounts. It's no longer a fad. So we see. I think we'll continue to see that acceptance by the public, but perhaps government circles will be going a very different direction than what the U.S. population might be willing to do, and how they will engage with TikTok. So I think it's perhaps, as we alluded to in a couple of posts in the previous week's newsletter, it may be too big to fail, just because of the sheer volume of people who are using it now, and to suddenly turn off the tap like that would be a very significant blow to obviously those that are have their part of their business model might be mostly TikTok nowadays, and depending on what they're selling, if it's their brand or otherwise, or services. So we'll see where that goes. But I think there will be life. Will TikTok still exist in 2024? Probably in the United States, but probably not in U.S. government circles. And this legislation will have some riders attached to it, or conditions attached to it if it passes, that where all U.S. government officials are no longer able to use TikTok on government devices. You may see if, because a lot of this was predicated on the moves to ban, at least in U.S. government circles and state government circles, has been based on that data security issues, that they had not gotten assurances from the parent company of TikTok, ByteDance, Chinese-owned company, that data access was being secured. The member data or user data was secured from access by folks in China. So we'll see where that lands in the coming weeks and months. But certainly an interesting topic. Certainly when you look at the competitive landscape of international student recruitment, and kind of bring it back to what we talk about here and on a day-to-day basis at SMIE Consulting, is the use of social media in how we recruit internationally. has been a topic that has existed. It's happened since 2005 at least, that social media has been used to recruit international students in varying forms over those 15 years. And you look, 18 years now, excuse me, 18 years now, 2023, yeah. When I first started using social media in 2005 for student recruitment internationally, to today, it's been a regular part of, and a growing part of most universities' approach to student recruitment, and domestically and internationally. There are implications to this. So our folks who are at state institutions where the governments of those states have banned officials from using TikTok for marketing and recruitment and communications, is that putting them at a competitive disadvantage in the student recruitment game? It'll be a slight disadvantage if they had already been on and were making significant headway in terms of developing a brand internationally for their campus. But certainly, nobody in their right mind would go all in on one social media platform as their only tool to recruit international students. So it'll be a small hindrance if for those institutions that are impacted in states where it's banned. But I certainly don't think it's going to severely hamper universities that are trying to leverage different social media platforms in different markets. And when you think about it, you look at what's happened with social media. There's always something new coming down the pipeline, and TikTok internationally probably hasn't been as well developed as many other platforms on Instagram and Facebook, which have certainly received, and YouTube received probably the lion's share of attention from U.S. institutions looking to leverage social platforms abroad. The obvious exceptions to that would be U.S. colleges and universities that have been operating in China already and already knew that they had to use Chinese-owned properties to function in China, like WeChat and Douyin and Youku and all those other platforms, Weibo. So we'll see what happens in the future, but TikTok surely will survive 2023, but will to varying degrees, institutions maybe who weren't even thinking about going down the TikTok road might be put off by the government's decision, but those who are still able to use it will continue to do so, I'm sure, without many reservations. So let's move on to question number 2. Will China's struggling, that has been struggling with their reopening, will that struggle impact spring intakes? And there's a lot of evidence out there for those who have been following it. We see a lot of different things. And the first link I'll be posting is an unfortunate news story where you see visa services have now been canceled or closed at U.S. consulates in China as a result of the huge increases in COVID cases that have been happening across the country since the Chinese Communist Party relaxed restrictions on movement within the country within the last 3 weeks. And that has led to an explosion of cases and hospitalizations and deaths. We don't know official figures because they won't release those. We know that's happened throughout the pandemic. They've been very tight-lipped. I think they said they've only had 5,000 deaths during the entire pandemic. So that's a lot of poppycock as far as I'm concerned. The numbers are in the one estimate I've heard of what's been happening recently could push China beyond what the U.S. has experienced all throughout the pandemic in terms of total deaths just in the next 6 months, based on the projections that at least independent reports are picking up from different hospitals and kind of expanding that countrywide. So we'll see what happens with these. I'm really a little curious as to why. Well, we're all curious as to what we think we know the reasons why they reopened. The government reopened in terms of allowing travel, because they've taken huge hits reputationally. They've taken huge hits economically in the country, and frankly, they were facing some political protests from citizenry that was unseen in China. Public protests against the government and things that were said about the regime were had never been uttered in public and certainly recorded like that in Western media. And that's something that the government had to respond to. And as a result of 3 years of being pent up and in various stages of lockdown and significant restrictions on movement within the country, let alone being able to travel abroad, we know that flights in and out of China had been restricted to probably 10 or 15% of what they were pre-pandemic. So there just really wasn't access to leave and to get an affordable flight to come to the U.S. or to go abroad. So what happens in the coming weeks and months as we move forward in the pandemic, the immediacy of the next month, when spring intakes are happening across the country, with the closure of the U.S. Embassy and consulates in China right now, new students aren't going to be able to get visas to come back or to come in for the first time. They're probably going to be deferring again if they hadn't already deferred from the fall. So we're seeing going to be seeing a huge shift if the situation does not change. And again, it's January 4th today. We do know, for example, on January 8th, China is removing quarantine restrictions for those that are coming into China. And they're doing that to hopefully see some rebound in their certainly tourism dollars and such. So what we've seen in terms of the articles that have been published recently, we've seen a lot of different variations on whether these restrictions on quarantine are suddenly being lifted, are suddenly going to open up the floodgates. The flights still aren't all back on yet to allow more to come in and out of China. So I don't think the effect's going to be in time, and certainly not with the consulates closed. And why are the consulates closed? The consulates are closed because local staff, the local hires that might be affected by COVID or have been are impacted that they're not able to come into work, and when the staffing isn't at the right levels to fully function, have an embassy or consulate functional, then you can't have the visa services that you would normally have. Now, for new students that have been looking to come, obviously the January intake's not as big, but there was potential that those students that were trying to come in the fall couldn't get visas in time because of travel restrictions, couldn't get, and then deferred to the spring. Now thought this was the opportunity, but now with the visa services suspended. And I had a colleague ask me, actually a friend of ours who was from China originally. Our sons are in karate classes together, and he mentioned, well, that seems like that's a U.S. government decision to close the embassies and staff. Well, it is because they're dependent on having the staff to make their embassy or consulate operational. So, with so many explosions of cases around the country, those consulates have not been able to staff fully, and obviously can't have the visa services that they would like to have and would have normally had. Ironically enough, as that they were offering lifting of all the travel movement restrictions that the country had in place for so long. In varying degrees. So we'll see what happens with this one, but it's a pretty messy situation in China right now in terms of COVID and the cases and hospitalizations. We've talked in past about the challenges that this reopening has had, and we've seen what the populations that have been most directly impacted have been the elderly. They had lowest vaccination rates in China were among the elderly. I think they only had 60% vaccinated and among the elderly population, and the problems have been the quality of the vaccines that they had were only 50-60% as well. So you have over half for all those that were in that most impacted demographic for COVID. Those were the ones that were having were most susceptible to it, that were having vaccines that weren't as efficacious as the ones we might have gotten here in the West, that were 85-90% successful. So you really see some challenges with their infrastructure there. Hospitals are swamped at this point, and makeshift morgues popping up like we saw at the beginning stages of the pandemic here in the U.S. and in New York and some of the other bigger cities. That's really sad to see. It's sad anytime a pandemic takes lives, but to see it happening in a country that had held itself out as this great example of what how to contain a pandemic. And to now for it to be happening to this extent to them, the greatest extent of which we'll never know because we don't have access to that data, and the official figures are you can't trust it in terms of what's coming out from Chinese news sources. So we'll see what happens with this, but I think there is going to be a significant impact on Chinese students being able to come back to study, not only in the U.S. but other consulates that operate within China that are still issuing visas, or were going to be able to issue visas. Without interview requirements, it probably won't be as affected. It'll be down to whether they can get a flight. So we'll see how that happens for those that have intakes in the spring, post January 8th, and when travel restrictions are lifted for inbound and outbound. Certainly China is expecting to grow their inbound population of international students again once those quarantine restrictions are lifted next week, or this weekend actually, on Sunday. So we'll see what the data shows in the coming months on that. But certainly the Chinese struggles with reopening are going to continue. And we'll see how tours might be opening up in the spring and the fall. Probably fall is probably the most realistic time when recruiters will be going back into country. I'm sure they could get in the spring now with the quarantine lifts are happening, but I don't know if it's the best environment to go back to right now. Even being fully vaccinated, you never know what's going to happen when the next lockdown would happen. That might impact your travel. So situations certainly a lot of dust in the air right now. And uncertainty, frankly, in terms of Chinese ability to leave, but also our ability to go there and recruit. So we'll need to continue to rely on our boots on the ground forces there in terms of agents, Education USA, alumni that might be operating in country, or staff that can still do the job of meeting with prospective students and parents and convincing them about our institutions. So we'll see where that goes. So let's get on to our last question of the day. And that is one that I've enjoyed talking about over the years, and it's not last couple of years at least, since it was first introduced as a kind of a stopgap measure, particularly used in India to great effect to allow more visas to be issued. It was the biggest hang-up for high volume countries has frankly been the visa interview requirement that the U.S. has that very few other countries have, that often involves extensive security checks that aren't necessarily part of that interview. But what has been the policy is that anyone that needs a security clearance or some levels of security clearance, that work is done either after the application, before the interview, and shortly after the interview, before a visa can be issued. And those checks, we saw this during post 9/11 world when particularly male Muslim students would be delayed months because of the security clearances that required. That process has sped up quite a bit since, but there's still security clearances for Chinese STEM students that happened during the Trump administration are still an issue, but that do take time. But you see, when we look at the bigger picture, the waiver of the in-person visa requirements is a significant one. If this is the big if, for individuals who had previously been issued a U.S. visa, it could be a visitor visa, it could have been a student visa, any other type of non-immigrant visa. If they had a visa issued in the last 5 years, that interview requirement would be waived. And that means it's just a paperwork decision. Documents get sent and passport gets returned with the visa stamp once everything's signed, sealed, delivered, and then the person is free to go to the U.S. So that's been a huge help to high volume countries like India to clear in the past year. In 2022, U.S. Embassy and consulates in India approved over 120,000 Indian student visas, F1 student visas for Indians to come to the U.S. Record. So we're gonna if we see more countries, high volume countries, also be able to take advantage of this, it will make it again easier for returning visa applicants, not just student, but any non-immigrant visa, visitor visa, could then take advantage of this waiver and just have to file their paperwork once they get their new I-20s for institutions to come back or renew their visas. So it's a real positive step in terms of extending that. The challenge is it's only been extended through 2023. We were hoping it would be made permanent, but that's not happened. There's still a lot of things that need to be answered when it comes to immigration and visa issuance policies that whenever the pandemic era exceptions like this, like the at least a limit of only one online class per term, if and when we do go back to that regulation, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Frankly, a lot of institutions will be facing that issue. So we'll see what happens with that in the coming weeks and months. But a lot of positives coming out of the waiver extension. But if it truly would be a groundbreaking one if it were made permanent, even more so if we could have some of these other issues that we know need addressing from both the consular affairs side at State Department, but also on immigration regulations within USCIS. So we'll see what happens next on these and many other issues, but extend to all of you who've been faithful followers of the Roundup here live on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. Appreciate you being a part of the conversation each week, but also want to extend a special shout out and thank you to those who listen to the audio only podcast. We're hitting 22,000 downloads. So 2,200 downloads. I wish 22,000. We're hitting 2,200 downloads this week. So we're very grateful for your continued engagement with us through the on-demand versions of the Roundup. So thanks so much for being a part, and we hope you have a very happy and prosperous new year. Thanks very much. Cheers.